This is a Geek Leader podcast, and I'm your host, John Rauda. This show is all about helping us grow as leaders, become better technologists, and improve our lives both at work and at home. I hope you enjoy the show and learn a lot. Hello, world. Welcome to episode 200 of a Geek Leader podcast, and I'm your host, John Rauda. And today's sponsor is Private Internet Access. If you've ever surfed the web and wanted to do it securely, especially when you're traveling or using someone else's network, you definitely need private internet access. Private internet access allows you to have a secure VPN without them logging what data what you're doing, what transactions you're making, or anything like that, to connect to anywhere in the world. You can also change your default location so it appears as if you're coming from a different place. Why is this helpful, you say? If you're not doing anything nefarious, well, it's really helpful if you want to test DNS resolution from different places and different time zones. It's a really cool tool, and it's not very expensive at all. You can get plans starting at $3.99 a month, and you can find out more by going to ageekleader.com/VPN. Again, that's ageekleader.com/VPN. All right, Geek Leaders. Today on the show, I've got Jake Jacobs, and he is here with our 200th episode. And we're going to be talking about change and how to leverage change. And there's 8 ways to achieve faster, better results. And Jake has been doing this for quite some time, helping out more than 60 different industries, from high tech, manufacturing to hospitality, entertainment, financial services. So this is going to be a fantastic conversation. Hope you guys enjoy it. Welcome to the show, Jake.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it, Don.
If you don't mind just telling the audience kind of a little bit about how you got into doing what you're doing and exactly what are you doing these days?
That's a good question. So actually, my consulting career started quite a while ago. When I was in college, I attended bar, which I recommend everybody either tend bar or wait tables at some point in their life. So they can really understand that service mentality. But anyway, I was tending bar, and I had an independent study project I wanted to do at the bar, which was consulting to it. And I asked the owner of the bar whether I could do it. And he said to me, this was my first contract for consulting. He said, "Fine, Jacobs, do whatever you want, just don't F anything up." So that was my first consulting contract. And I've been doing this work for 35 years since then, different contracts than I started with, obviously, and did my early work with Ford Motor in the early to mid 80s. And what we were working on was culture change around a more participative culture. And again, with your listeners, there were a lot of IT leaders as well as engineering folks, production. We helped the relaunch of the Mustang. There were 2,000 people working on that, and we got them all together in 4 separate ballrooms and had them get clear what the vision was for that relaunch of the Mustang and what it was that they wanted to create for the customer. So my work that I say, John, is very simply, I work with people who lead change in organizations that are frustrated that the results they achieve are too slow, too hard, or too often disappointing. And unfortunately, that's a very large client population to be working with, because a lot of people struggle with change. And I'm not just talking about CEOs, I'm talking about anybody who leads change, whether it's a project team or whether it's a plant manager or whether it's just an informal leader who people listen to a little differently than they do everybody else on the team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely, that resonates with me. I know I've been at a couple of companies where trying to change is sometimes frustrating and slow, and especially if you're not the boss. If you are the CEO or the top guy, it's a little bit easier, in my opinion. But like out of being in middle management, sometimes you try to affect change and you feel like you're not getting anywhere, Right. But also, you mentioned the Mustang. I just have to take a little side thing. Mustangs are probably my second favorite car, second to Tesla. I had a 66 Mustang back in the day, and I loved that thing. It was awesome.
Yeah, well, we weren't launching the 66. It was a little later than that,
Yeah.
John, but it was from the same bloodlines.
Yeah, definitely. All right, well, cool. So going back to change, so what are some of the common frustrations that you see people dealing with when you're talking about slow change or change that with the result isn't quite what they expected or planned?
Yeah, so let me answer this two ways, John. I'm going to answer it from a CEO perspective, and then I'm going to speak to this middle manager dilemma
Mhm.
that you described. I say, rather than getting stuck with starting everything at the top, then you start where there's impact to make a difference, and then follow the energy that you see in the organization. So, where can you make the biggest impact? A lot of times that can be in the middle of the organization. Anybody can have impact in the organization if they choose to. And I know it's frustrating a lot of times in middle management because you feel like your arms are tied behind your back and they get blamed for a lot, right? The top
Yeah.
blames them and the bottom blames them, and they're the middle of the sandwich rather than like a rollout, which is a traditional thing. We go level by level and there's cascading. What my argument is to say, where do you have people who want to do this change work? Who's motivated to do it? Who's excited? Who's energized? And that's where we go to do the work next. And I've got plenty of stories of working in organizations that started in the middle, started at the bottom. One of them turned into a 2-year effort. It was written up in Fortune and Business Week. Happened to be a telecom, but what they did is they engaged the whole organization in the conversation about what the future needed to look like. So I believe strongly that engagement is a very powerful tool, and used wisely can make an enormous difference in an organization's future.
So, like, I'm trying to think about this from, my perspective and things that I've done. I've been part of. Have you ever heard the term digital transformation?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Yes. So I've gone through formal and informal kind of digital transformations at different companies, and it sounds like one of the best ways to kind of go through a change like that is to get engagement by having people involved up front and early on in the process. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. And the earlier, the better.
Hmm.
There's one other thing I want to mention because these levers, John, apply to any change in any organization made by anyone. So if you're an individual, you can take these levers, and I'll give you a couple examples from the book. And as a team leader, you can, and as a senior leader in an organization. But when there's change, most people will tell you, pay attention to the change. Keep your eye on the ball. If we're about digital transformation, then find all the things that need to be different. And what I say is that that's half the equation. It's like one hand clapping. And the
Hmm.
other piece of the puzzle that's essential is continuity. What are you not going to change? And that a lot of times when we get focused on change, people get anxious. Yeah, and I think when we talk about engagement, we got to think about it with some fresh lenses. So when most people talk about engagement, what they're looking at is people who are impacted by the change. I mean, that's sort of the definition of a stakeholder. And what I believe is that you got to go 2 levels out, 2 circles out from those people that are the usual suspects. And so when I talk about somebody who's an IT engineer, I'm not just talking to engage that person, but who do they serve? And then who do those other people serve? So a
Hmm.
lot of times in organizations, I've had customers in meetings, end user customers in meetings to be able to talk about what their needs are. And a lot of times at the beginning, people look strangely like, maybe they showed up at the wrong conference room or somebody came to the wrong meeting. But what I impress upon them is that these people's voices are as important as anybody else's in the room. And sometimes more important.
Yeah, for sure. And I like that idea of going around to the, not just the person you want to affect change on, but the people that they support and those others, because that shows that you're taking the effort to go even further. But it also brings, I guess I don't want to say pressure, but more impact. It shows more of an impact to the person that's affecting the change.
Yeah, and what I would say, John, is that when we're talking about digital transformation, there are some radical changes that everybody needs to deal with because we're
Hmm.
really talking about entirely different ways of working and entirely different tools to use in our work. So a lot of consultants, leaders, people who are project in charge of these digital transformations or really any change in an organization what they pay attention to is the change.
Mhm.
And you sort of get told, don't take your eye off the ball. These are the things that need to be different, and we should pay attention to them, chart them, track them, and try and achieve them.
Mhm.
And while I would say that that's smart to do, I also talk about what not to change. And what not to change is what I call continuity. So there's like two hands clapping in this equation. And one of them is about what needs to be different, but the other one is about what I call continuity. So when I work with clients, I'll often have them pull up a couple flip charts and say, well, let's first document everything that needs to change. And they start filling those flip charts out. And it can be a little overwhelming for some people because when you look left and right, there are a lot of changes that happen with a digital transformation or something that's IT driven. And
Yeah.
then I say to them, all right, now let's step back and let's build a list of all those things that are not going to change. All those things that are going to stay the same. Only this time I want you to make the list twice as long. And they start brainstorming. And what starts to occur in that group is an awareness of how much continuity there is. And the benefit of continuity is it gives people a firm ground to stand on before they take a leap into the unknown of what that future is going to be. And so there's more certainty, there's more confidence, there's more clarity if we also pay attention to continuity as well as change. So there are a lot of things in this book, Leverage Change, that are counterintuitive. They are a different way of looking at the world of change than we typically take.
Yeah, for sure. And I think your first lever was pay attention to continuity, which was, pay attention to what stays the same. And so, like you said about, the paradox, there's a lot of that in there. You want to go through some of the levers that you talk about, and actually, why don't you use the term lever? And
Yeah.
what is a
So,
lever in your definition in the book?
right. So these levers come from a story that was told by a guy named Archimedes, who was a 3rd century BC Greek mathematician. So, your listeners may be saying, what are we talking about? I thought we were talking about IT and leadership and the rest. Well, Archimedes had a saying. He described the power of leverage by saying, give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I shall move the world. And so my belief is that people can move the world in the arena of change by engaging with these levers. That the leverage I actually had without knowing, John, 25 years ago, I commissioned a chalk drawing of Archimedes because I've always talked with clients about leverage and finding really what are small strategic actions that can have major positive consequences. That's really the definition of leverage. And so these levers all are things that you can do relatively easily, but they will make a big difference in getting you faster, easier, better results. So let me pause, right? And say, I could speak to one of the levers, but let me see if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, it does. Absolutely.
So here's another one of these levers. This is one of the most powerful ones, and it's one of the easiest ones, which again is kind of paradoxical. But people often complain that change takes too long. So this is the problem we're trying to deal with. And the lever that addresses it is called think and act as if the future were now. So most of the time, when we think about the future, it's something out there. It's going to occur at a later point in time, and we have to wait for it to occur. Now, I think that there's something flawed in that assumption that if we turn that on its head and we say, think and act as if the future were now, that means that we get any image of the future, any picture of possibility of where we may be heading, grab hold of it and pull it back into the present and start thinking and acting as if we were already in that future. So let me make this a little more concrete for your listeners. I was in a meeting with the chief information officer and his direct reports. And when they were working on a particular strategy, there was a grand debate in the morning session about, A or B. And people took up sides, made their arguments. It started to get more contentious, more conflict, and they couldn't decide which way to go. So I'm listening to this conversation, and they said they wanted a more participative organization. So I'm thinking about this think and act as if the future were now lever. And I said to them, well, who else has information about this particular issue in this strategy? And they said, well, there are people in this building in the engineering department. And then there are also some people at different sites in different places of the country. And so I said, all right, well, wouldn't it be helpful if their perspective were added to the jigsaw puzzle here? And everybody said yes. And they said, okay, well, we'll meet again next week. And they started getting their calendars out. And I'm thinking, is this really thinking and acting as if the future were now, if you want a more participative organization? So I said to them, I said, we're breaking for lunch. Let's get those people in the room after lunch and have them be part of this meeting rather than waiting a week and coming back to it after, it's not as fresh and you haven't engaged people. So at lunch, they made phone calls, they got on video cameras, they reached out to people during their lunch breaks and said, we'd like you in this meeting. So a group of 10 all of a sudden became a group of 40. And these 40 people had a conversation about these two strategies. And what happened as these other 30 started to talk, a third strategy started to emerge. And what turned out happening was this third strategy won the day. That in fact, the two that the senior leaders had come up with originally, because they started to think and act as if the future were now, rather than waiting till next week or next year or whenever it would turn out to be, in that meeting, in that day, right then and there, they started to look at how they could change their behavior. And so anybody that's listening, this is not something that you need a big formal change effort to do. You can look at your calendar and you can say, well, what would be happening typically later on in our process, downstream from here? Grab hold of it and bring it back upstream so that it can happen faster. And the line between the present and the future gets blurry. You don't know which one am I living right now, and that's a good sign, not being able to identify it. And the other thing that happened with this, John, is the believability index increases. So I talk with clients about, if you're trying to make a change, a lot of people are like, this too shall pass. I'll wait long enough and I won't have to worry about this. Or a new leader will come in, they'll have a new strategy, a new design, a new structure, and I won't have to change. Well, if you're thinking and acting as if the future were now, what you find is that when people look left and right at their colleagues, people are doing business in new ways and better ways. And so as you start to build your confidence, you're like, wait a second, I don't want to get left behind. And I've got a lot more confidence that this is going to be for real because I see it occurring in real time right around me.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when you're thinking about the future and how you can plan, there's been so many times I've been in meetings where I said, oh yeah, once we finish that implementation, then we'll change our process. And it's always like, no, why don't we change our process now and then get the tool to fix it? Once we can go through this and see how we need to implement the tool. Because if we wait, we're just kicking the can down the road.
Yeah, and I talk with clients about shrinking the time between planning and implementation. Because a lot of things end up, you get a binder on the shelf problem with planning. If you spend too much time or analysis paralysis, or there's a lot of bad names that go with planning. And I don't think necessarily it always deserves them. But if you say we're going to plan now and we're going to implement later, you violated this lever and you've given up having change occur faster.
So one of the levers that caught my attention when I was looking through them was the design it yourself lever. And, in software development and IT world, you go through this debate of build versus buy quite frequently. Where does this fit in, or does this lever fit into the build versus buy discussion that happens quite often in technology?
Sure. So what I would say is I often come from a world of both and.
Yeah.
So rather than an either or choice, which I believe a lot of times is a flawed choice, that design it yourself says, instead of taking some process off the shelf and following it religiously, whether it's 6 steps or 8 phases or whatever it may be, and pulling out the book on change. And there are a lot of consultants who would come in, or change experts, and they would say, look, I know the way this happens best, and I've got the way, the truth, and the light, and thou shalt follow me. And I say, maybe, because each organization is different. In each organization, part of the ownership of this kind of work is because people design it themselves. So I may take pieces and parts of something that's worked before. I even encourage clients to look back at past change efforts and say, well, what's worked about that? And let's bring that forward into the present, which again goes back to this pay attention to continuity thing. But when you design it yourself, there's 3 elements that are really important. One of them is, what's the purpose of what you're trying to accomplish? And the purpose, Simon Sinek has been on TED Talks and has written several books. He calls it your why. But if you can get to a fundamental purpose, not that we're trying to reduce costs or something like that, but what is the grander purpose of why we're doing this? What will be different in the world because we've made this change, right? Are we serving our customers better? Are we inventing new ways of business being done? But that purpose is really critical because it's a North Star. And then the second element is around outcomes and deliverables, because a lot of project teams, when they're stood up and they look at their charters, deliverables is an important part. And for me, deliverables helps you measure whether in fact you're achieving that purpose. So the metrics that you get around this are an important piece. And then the last one is your roadmap. So how are you going to get from A to B? What are you going to do? Who are you going to engage? When, why, how? And so when you ask this question about build and buy, I would come back and say, well, first of all, let's start with the purpose of what you're trying to accomplish, instead of getting stuck in that question, which is at some level more tactical. And then let's get clear what we're trying to accomplish. And then finally, let's come to this question. And some things you may build, some elements make sense to build, and others make sense to buy. And it also depends, how fast do you want this to occur? So it's a lot quicker to go ahead and buy, whether it's talent or technology. You can move a lot faster, but do you need to move that fast? And if you build, are there internal capabilities that you could develop with the existing resources that you have? And will that serve you better? But the question about what are we going to accomplish and what's our purpose, if you get a clear purpose, it will help make those decisions around build or buy.
Yeah, and I think sometimes that clear purpose isn't as well defined as some of the requirements that are necessary. People they skip over sometimes that why into the how, and it gets a little bit difficult sometimes as in technology. A lot of times we get requests, right? We're not always the change agents leading the change. We're more or less the ones that are figuring out how to do it and implementing it. And it can get sometimes challenging where someone gives you, they said, here's the how and the what, but they never tell you the why. It gets a little bit challenging at that point.
Yeah, and here's a little tool that I would offer your listeners, and this may be something they're already familiar with, and I may be preaching to the choir, but in the quality movement a long time ago, they came up with this approach called the 5 why. And I don't know, John, if this is something familiar to you or your listeners.
Yeah. I was going through some Six Sigma training a while back when we were going through the DMAIC process and learning about that. I think that came up there.
Yeah. And so this 5 why, what it does is it gets you to deeper and deeper reasons about the why we're doing something. And so at the surface, you may say, well, we're trying to save money. Okay. Well, why are we trying to save money? So that we can invest it elsewhere. Well, why are you trying to invest it elsewhere? Well, so that we can innovate. Why are we trying to innovate? It's so we can become a market leader. And why do we want to become a market leader? Because we want to dominate the future. Well, okay, at the end of the day, is that going to get you up and out of bed, or is saving money going to get you up and out of bed? And dominating the future is something that I want to be I want to be a winner. I want to be somebody who dominates. I'm not just talking about winning in the marketplace and having a slightly bigger share than somebody else, but when you dominate in the marketplace, that may be your core purpose. And that's something that people can get behind. And you get a lot of what I call the unlimited resource of energy within your organization. It's one of the few resources that you don't have to give up on. It's never ending. And can people get more energetic and more excited, more compelled, bigger buy-in? I'd say yes. And you tell me when that stops, but when you've been on a project that really engages you, that taps into all of your talents and abilities, and your team is humming along and working really well, you know what that feels like. And I'm a big proponent that says that shouldn't be a special event. That should be every day in every organization, and at least the goal, because the closer you get to that, the better it is for everybody. Everybody wins. The company wins, the customer wins, the people who are working in the organization win, the leaders win. I mean, it is the best goal that you could set for yourself, is having that kind of day when you get up and go to work in the morning.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's, that's one of the should be one of the goals of any leader, is to have that kind of I don't know if you call it inspiration, but that feeling whenever you are working, that you're moving towards something that's important, and you want to master that.
Yeah, and so you asked about the levers, John. So here's
Mhm.
another one that I think is helpful. And the problem that we're trying to solve with this lever, I describe it as people get to only do the routine work of their regular job. So there's nothing wrong with excelling in your regular job. I think that's like a minimum critical specification. If you're not doing that, then you got to either find another job, find another person for that job, or develop the person in that job so they can excel.
Right.
But as a minimum critical specification, is that the way that I want to go through life with my minimum critical specifications, right? I want more. I want my clients and I want me to be greedy. So the lever that I put in place to address this is called find opportunities for people to make a meaningful difference. So what that says is that when you have change, there are great opportunities for people to step up if leaders let go a little bit of control and look for opportunities for people to be able to make a profound difference. And leading a team, taking on a special project, all of these things are different than our day job. But a lot of people, I think, get stuck only doing their day job and even excelling in it. Yep, that's back to that minimum critical spec. But can we thrive is a whole different question. And excelling in our day job is for me not thriving. So rather than seeing change as something that you got to be nervous about and be anxious about and you don't know and kind of shy away from, I talk to people about embrace the change and find opportunities to contribute. And if you're a leader, look for people. And if you're not seeing opportunities, then ask. Because if you can ask people what would be a profound contribution that you could make, people have answers to those questions. They just never get asked them. So as a leader, if I go out and I start asking people that question, I'm going to get some really good answers that are going to make a difference for the change work that I'm doing, whatever it might be.
So, um, how is it that you go about finding those people that are excited to do something new and to try something new, and to get them being your change agents?
Right. So here's what I would say to that, John. The people who are excited, they're easy to find because they're volunteering, right? And often in an organization, it's the same people volunteering time and again. So, like those people are easy to identify because they were on the last team and the team before that.
So, what do you do with the
Now,
others that aren't that aren't
right,
easy that aren't volunteering?
right. So, the way that I look at this is there's a group of people in an organization that we have a name for. Now, different people use different names, and we're on a podcast. So I'm just going to use, you know, the socially acceptable way of describing them as troublemakers. right? There are other words that are more colorful that people have for describing these people, but we know who they are. They're the people who get stuff off the rails. They dominate conversations in meetings. They don't vote for the popular option and they don't go along with what the consensus of the group is. They're always raising like another issue that they see with it. It's sort of like, I think Eeyore in the Winnie the Pooh story was like the original troublemaker, right? He was always finding something wrong. I wrote a book called You Don't Have to Do It Alone: How to Involve Others to Get Things Done. And in there, we had a special section on troublemakers. And what we said, and I think, you could almost have your listeners like write this down on a Post-it and be able to keep it on the side of their desk, which is troublemaking is in the eye of the beholder. And what I mean by that is if I happen to see you, John, as a troublemaker, I'm going to treat you like one and you're going to behave like one. So we'll make a deal. It's not an explicit deal, but the more I treat you like a troublemaker and try and shut you down. I mean, I had one story, John, where there was an executive team and everybody that I interviewed said there was a problem with Harry, right? Even Harry said he was a problem. Right. And so I said, okay, well, we'll need to work on this. And I said, okay, I'll be back in 2 weeks. And I came back in 2 weeks and I said, so how are things going? And everybody said, yeah, it's fine. Fine. I said, well, how's this situation with Harry? And one of the people said to me, it's fixed. And I said, well, that's remarkable. You've been complaining about this for like years and Harry being a pain in the rear. And like, how did you fix this problem? And this person looked at me totally serious and said, we stopped inviting him to our meetings.
Hmm.
Now,
how does that fix the problem?
Right. If effective short-term solution, really, really bad long-term solution. So troublemakers, if you treat them as valuable contributors to your team, if you treat them as having information that the rest of the team is not paying attention to, and this is not easy, right? Because they've been a pain in the rear for as long as you could remember. And it's like all of a sudden flipping the switch and treating them like valuable team members. You're like, yeah, that's great theory, but you come work for me and you deal with, John or Sue or whoever it may be, and you try and treat them like valuable team members. That, go write that in a book, buddy. But what I will say is if you can challenge yourself, even if it's a little bit that you create a little space for them to contribute and make a positive difference, what you will find is it becomes a virtuous cycle. So the more that you start to treat them that way, the more they start to behave that way, the easier it gets for you to create a little bit more space for them to add value, and the more value they will add. And so, I've worked in organizations where people were on the verge of getting fired. And I talked with them about this in terms of make a profound difference. And this lady became the most valuable member on the team. Literally, they had a board presentation coming up, and everybody wanted Mary to listen to their presentation and give them advice because she represented how some of the board members were going to be thinking. And without her input, they'd have been blindsided. So this whole notion of, troublemaking, and do you see people who are fence sitters? There are reasons they're on that fence. Now, most of the time, we try and convince them that they should come over to our side. And again, paradoxically, what I would say is we need to ask them, why are you on the fence? What is it that you're concerned about that is keeping you from committing to the work that we need to do? And actually listening to those people will give you great insight and great ideas. You don't have to do everything that these people say. They don't have the answer, but they've got information that you're missing. It's like jigsaw puzzle pieces. When you don't have all the pieces, you don't get the picture. And if your picture is the one of the future vision, you're going to be missing some things. And those people could have helped you, but you left them behind because they didn't get on board. They were causing mischief. They were causing trouble. Whatever name you give them, you didn't give them the time of day. And I think that's a shame in a lot of organizations because these people could make a difference.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I've seen that before. I've seen that in many cases where someone was left out, and yet they had like the bright idea. They had that missing puzzle piece that you were looking for. When it all came together, that you were missing. And if you would have just included them early on, and found out where their talents and gifts are for this project, you could have leveraged them in the future.
Yep, absolutely. So that's one of the other levers that I talk about is find opportunities for people to make a meaningful difference. It's like, even and especially the troublemaker,
Mhm.
right? Especially the troublemaker.
Well, I mean, that comes into, you want a diverse group of people helping you with these, because you're going to get different perspectives. And sometimes that different lens and that perspective from who you say is the quote troublemaker may be the insight that helps you, move this thing forward.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. And there's another thing in addition to troublemakers, because we got names for them and we put them in boxes and we don't invite them to meetings if you're part of this one organization. But another very, very popular thing that happens in organizations around change is people ask, what's in it for me? Right? In fact, in the organizations I've been part of, they actually make it an acronym because everything that's worth anything becomes an acronym as part of an organization, right? So this one's WIFM. And WIFM about what's in it for me. See, I think that's a valid question. A lot of people will look at that and say, well, that's kind of selfish. And you're looking at, looking out for number one, and you're really not a team player because you're kind of stepping back, looking at what am I going to get?
Mhm.
And I look at that and I say, it's not an unreasonable question to ask, what's the benefit for me in making this change? And so the lever that I came up with to deal with this what's in it for me problem, I call it develop a future people want to call their own. So by that, what that means is that we've got to create a future that people are excited to call their own, which means they've got to be involved in creating this future. And there are a lot of ways that you can get creative about engaging people, whether it's individually in small groups and large groups. But when you're asking what's in it for me, I think that's out of a fear that people don't see themselves in the future and they don't know what that future is going to look like. And so if we develop one that we want to call our own, I understand what that future is. I know what my role is in that future. I know if I don't have those skills that I got to go out and get them. And all of those things that get in the way of sort of this seemingly selfish what's in it for me, if you treat these seriously, there's an easy solution to it, which is this lever that I just described.
Absolutely. Well, I really appreciate you having you on the show and learning about these levers. And if you don't mind, Jake, just tell people where they can find out more about the things that you're working on and pre-order a copy of this book, because I don't think it's out yet. Is that right? I know
Right,
you sent
right.
me an early copy, and I appreciate that. But when is it coming out?
So it comes out May 4th, 2021. And you can pre-order it on Amazon. You could look up Leverage Change, and it is the only book that you'll find on Amazon that talks about this concept of leverage going back to Archimedes. And any engineer will understand the power of leverage.
Mhm.
And I think we'll now understand, hopefully, the power of applying it to the world of change. So you can find me at my website, which is jakejacobsconsulting.com. And, where the book describes levers and what they are, we've got programs and coaching, group consultations, a lot of opportunities for people to learn how to apply the levers. So where one deals with what the levers are, the other side of the coin says, how do we apply them, and takes you through specific steps so that you can use those individually with your team, with your whole organization. The other thing that I would invite people to do is to connect with me on LinkedIn. If they happen to be on LinkedIn, I'm Jake Jacobs on LinkedIn, and I'm having a lot of fun, John, doing videos where they're short videos, a couple minutes, on popular topics. I call them Jake on Change. And they've been getting a lot of positive reviews because they deal with things that are real issues that people are facing. So I will tell you, I am a Michigan fan. I went to the University of Michigan. We happened to lose in the basketball tournament to UCLA recently.
That was a great game too.
Yeah, it was a great game if you weren't a Michigan fan. So one of the things that your listeners will probably know something about is John Wooden, who coached at UCLA for a number of years, won 10 championships in 12 years. He's got more championships than the next 3 coaches combined. And so I did a video on John Wooden, and the title of the video was Why Try and Win? And so a lot of people get caught up in winning. Well, Coach Wooden had something, he never used the word win with his teams ever. And what he said was, you need to focus on getting the self-satisfaction of reaching your potential in everything that you do. And so in this 2 minutes, what I talk about is the difference between focusing on winning, which leads you to focus on your competition. But if you're focused on reaching your own potential, you're doing the best that you very possibly can. And, if it's good enough for John Wooden, and I guess some of that stuck with UCLA recently against Michigan, but if it's good enough for John Wooden, 10 championships in 12 years, then I would say it's good enough for me and good enough for your listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll definitely link up your LinkedIn, the book, and your website all in the show notes. People can find that at geekleader.com. And again, Jake, thanks for coming on the show. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, John.
If you enjoyed that episode, please leave a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. I'd greatly appreciate that. And also, don't forget to check out merch. We have some T-shirts that I've designed that are on at geekleader.com. You can click on the merchandise section there and check that out. And also, don't forget about the books from our guests. So if you like this guest and other guests that have written books, please go ahead and check that out at geekleader.com. I would greatly appreciate it, and I'm sure they would too.